Welcome to Season 2, The Shattered Visage. When we last left our heroes, the looming shadow of the Machine King had finally arrived in Rene, on the same night that the full moon's guard beat back the creeping rot of Apostalys in the battle for Star Lake. With her old employer finally making his move on the old city, BC has few friends and fewer people she can trust. Hidden in her past lies the key to shaping this battle, but there's a reason BC has spent 3 years trying to forget. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of Rene, Val prepares for the next move in his one-man war on Kyrie Krona. But has the Iron Wolf of Edara finally found the one monster that he can't slay? Finally, in the heart of the Western Expanse, Cyrus stands alongside the full moon's guard to face the return of a centuries-old evil. But in a world growing ever smaller, and against the force responsible for the disappearance of the Valgardians, do the forces of the wild even have a chance? Beneath the secrets, the pacts, and the lies that hold together the fragile peace, lies the true face of Edara and the Freelands. Get ready for Season 2, and discover what peeks through beneath the cracks of the Shattered Visage. Prologue. Pellets for a rat. The fourth night of winter, just after sunset. In Cleft, the little town between the mountain passes where the Stone Creek flowed down towards the Mendarian, the wind began to rise, picking up from the west with the weight of a dying storm somewhere off Okeanos. Most of the town had already fallen silent, save for the glowing lights of a small tavern at the entrance to Cleft. The only illumination came from the fading moon. Gendro was not a smart man, nor a necessarily hard-working man, nor a particularly skilled man, but he was content, and in this town that was enough. If you had wandered the streets, found the locals who truly called Cleft their home, you'd find very few dreams and even less ambition. Like Gendro, most people in Cleft were simply content, serving the small stream of travelers that came over the land. They took just enough stories to keep life interesting, and just enough money to pay the bills. Now, Gendro ran West Cleft, the bar at the end of the road through the past, or the beginning, depending on where you had started. West Cleft got just about as much money as East Cleft, the bar at the opposite side of the road, and for both Gendro and Barth, who was East Cleft's owner, that was just fine. That night, the wind was blowing from West Cleft towards East Cleft, which was just hard enough to send the brush and small trees swaying side to side. And Gendro found himself up a little later than usual, winding down the tavern's common room and tidying up with the ease of a man who had nowhere in particular to go and all the time in the world to get there. The tables had been set back mostly into place, the floors were swept clean, or at least mostly clean, of dust and grime, and with a few little dabs of spit to scrub the last stains off the glasses, Gendro picked one for his end-of-evening drink while he counted the coin. It had been a good night, it seemed, as he laid out the coin into stacks of bronzes and double bronzes and the occasional silver. That would all cover expenses, with enough left over for a nice dinner the next night for family. And in fact, as Gendro noticed 2 sticky silvers that he'd missed, there was enough to sneak some of the fancy beer that he'd brought in from a Highland trader. That got Gendro in a good mood, and he hummed a little tune to himself. He loved an occasion to crack into fancy beer, and eyed the keg, which was already tapped and practically begging to be drunk, with a sneaky, devilish look. No one's gonna complain but me. Gendro grabbed a tankard and started filling it up with the frothing Highland beer. This little ritual was another that Gendro followed just about every night. If the coin was up, there was reason to celebrate and drink. If the coin was down, there was reason to mourn and drink. If the coin was exactly as expected, then that was a pretty notable occasion, and it was always observed by drinking. Gendro drained most of the beer in his glass in a single extended gulp. Then he refilled it, ignored the foam on his ample mustache, and made his way over to the chair by the window, staring out across the brushland to the trees. Things were turning a little concerning. It wasn't so much that the wind was blowing stronger than any other night, so much as it was blowing directly from the west, clear enough that you might have marked your compass by the heading of the breeze. Just steady, consistent, coming straight out of the west. Gendro squinted out into the night. Beyond the tree lines where the hills met the sky, over the northern edge of the Western Expanse, the dark clouds of a coming storm were headed towards them, and had already eaten the stars crowded around the horizon. True howling storms were very rare this time of year, just before winter had settled in, but Gendro was a safe man. So after setting his beer glass on a sheltered table, he began the slow and steady process of shuttering the windows, lowering the heavy wood covers and locking them shut one at a time. About midway through the process, the roll of thunder somewhere to the east brought Gendro a smile of self-satisfaction. Sometimes his wife scolded him for the late evenings closing down the bar, but he'd spotted the storm before anyone else had. And now, he would be happily snuggled up at home while others rushed around in the pouring rain trying to batten down the hatches. Just then, the strengthening wind pitched angrily at the shutters, which stretched against clanking latches as they voiced the storm's displeasure. But as the thunder rolled out again from the east, Gendro turned once, then twice. Again, something wasn't quite right. He had lived his entire life here, and though the people coming through the town often changed, the weather no longer surprised him. When the wind blew from the west, storms came from the west. When the wind blew from the east, storms came from the east. That was just the way the world worked. And yet there was another roll of thunder, closer from the east, while the western breeze continued to blow. That's not right. Grunting, Gendro made his way across the creaking floorboards to the front, and then out onto the porch, scanning the quiet road beyond West Cleft. But there was nothing out of line out there except the dairy bushes swaying in the wind. Usually, Gendro left the chairs and tables out on the deck during a storm. And most other times, nothing ever happened in Cleft after all, and who would want to steal some worn-down wooden furniture? It was probably more trouble to move and steal than the semi-reliable wood it had been built with. But against a storm like this one, which had now eaten the stars above the far end of the pasture land and was only getting closer, you could never be too careful. So Gendro set about pulling the furniture in and stacking it up inside. By the time he had brought in all of the chairs and tables, the storm had eaten the stars nearly directly overhead. And again, that thunder echoed out from the east, even closer than before and still coming from the entirely wrong direction. Gendro took a sip out of the glass that had been empty since 3 sips ago. There had been no flash of lightning from the east either. That was even stranger. Gendro turned back to the interior of the bar, quickly shutting the front door behind him and latching the thick lock on the front door shut. And as the Wind continued to batter at the shutters, demanding entry through a jangling of metal latches. Gendro knew it was time to go. Quickly, he stored the coin in its usual hiding place under the floorboards. Around him, the thunder was still grumbling in waves out from the east, as the western wind slammed against the shutters, beating for entry. Standing up with the quickness of a man who hadn't quite processed that he was nervous, Gendro turned to leave, only for the thunder to roar so close by it might have come from the front porch. But then, like the eastern thunder had somehow won out against the western storm, the shutters suddenly clicked into place and fell still. Outside, the sounds of the wind still whipped through the air, but it was like here, the wooden shutters had been commanded to be silent. And against the now quiet evening, there was a clear and gentle knock at the door. Each rap was casual, almost delicate, and yet the echo of the knocks hit Gendro in his chest. A visitor? At this hour? With the great-grandpappy of a storm about ready to come through? That was strange, too. Gendro stared at the door, and yet again those gentle, almost delicate knocks echoed out. Gendro blew out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was probably just someone stranded in the rain who'd seen the lights on. Coming? Making his way over to the door, Gendro undid the heavy latch and peeked out around the chain lock. The traveler had stepped back to the edge of the porch, where he looked out into the evening, long silvery hair spilling over a black traveling cloak that whipped in the evening wind, and gray-gloved hands clasped behind him. Hey buddy, sorry to say, but we're closed for the night. Besides, there's a hell of a storm coming. If you head back in the middle of town, there's an inn called Homestead. I'm sure you could find a bed to hunker down and wait until morning. I think they had a few open. Gendro got all that out without his voice shaking once, which he was surprised to be proud of. But when he finished speaking, the traveler still stood, looking out at the evening, hair and cloak falling still. Did you hear me, buddy? I really don't have time to be out here all night, especially with that storm coming. Forgive me. Lost in thought. I was hoping you might have a cup of ale, maybe some food for a cold and damp traveler. I'm begging your pardon, but kitchen and bar are both closed. Gendro started to edge away from the door. Nah, like I said, if you head over to Homestead, you can find a spot for the night, and I can see about. The traveler flicked his hand with a flourish, and suddenly it clinked and weighed heavy with a sizable velvet pouch of coin. Good sir, I do understand the inconvenience. Gendro eyed the pouch, the cut of the clothes, the general manner, and ran the numbers in his head. Well, I guess we could make something up for you. The traveler swept into the room, cloak swirling behind him, with a gentleness and elegance of step that made it seem like he was moments away from dancing. And yet beneath his feet, the floorboards cried out in protest, like they did when Fat Horford Bwens got too excited. Gendro tested the floorboards again as he passed behind the man, but they barely bent half as much under Gendro's weight. The traveler was thicker than he looked under that cloak, Gendro guessed, but that was neither here nor there. Well, you can just find a spot at the bar. I'll see what I can grab from the back, Gendro said as the stranger sashayed to the bar, taking a seat and never once looking back at Gendro. Won't be hot, but I can sure wrestle something together. Oh, yes, I'll gladly take the best of whatever you have, good man. I understand it's on short notice. The traveler was looking around, almost disinterested, and seemingly lost in thought again as he gazed around the bar. As Gendro walked by towards the kitchen, he took stock of his new guest, which was somewhat easy with the man so distracted. Elegant black and silver accented his smooth-collared jacket and traveling pants, meeting black boots and silver gloves, all finely worked beyond anything cleft folk could dream of. And yet, as Gendro spotted the thin streaks of dust along the man's boots, trousers, and coat, he had almost expected more. Nobles and upper-class merchants tended to dress in colors and jewelry so fine you could see them sparkling and jangling from a mile away. On top of that, those high-class people rarely ever left their wagons, and would never have been caught without a full retainer of guards, escorts, and staff. There was a fine woven string around the stranger's head, which was to hold a patch over his eye, and that might have given him away as a soldier, but officers never traveled alone, and never in such fine clothes. It was all more confounding information, and Gendro filed it all away as he passed the man and made his way to the back. There, he inspected a stale loaf of bread that he'd planned to use for breadcrumbs, and left it by one of the remaining torches to hopefully warm it up a little bit. And over there was some roast leftovers, which Gendro had been set to throw out after this evening. After all, it was mostly scraps and gristle swimming in congealed fat and drippings, but with a little effort and a little inventiveness, there was enough to salvage a plate. Waving off a pair of flies, Gendro stirred the roast to loosen the fat a bit, and cut the bread up, snagging a damp plate from the drying rack and inspecting it before waving it dry and rubbing the last spots off on his sleeve. In all, it was a good enough meal for nearly midnight. But returning to the room, Gendro stumbled and nearly dropped his entire tray. The traveler was still humming, still carefree, but across the countertop there was a flood of gold coins, spilled from 3 more pouches like the traveler had been holding. And across the table, about half of the coins had already been assembled into neat stacks in rows that grew by the second. The stranger had left the countertop in front of himself open, just wide enough to leave room for the tray, and happily settled into a rhythmic gathering and stacking and sliding into place of more money than Gendro had seen in his entire lifetime. Good man, barkeeper, whoever you are. I don't want that meal to get any colder than it already is, so if you could deliver me my dinner, thank you. The traveler trailed off again into the steady gather, stack, slide of coin across the table. That was when Gendro realized he was still just staring with the plate in hand. And finally he recovered enough to deliver the meal. Shivering at the sideways glance the stranger sent him, Gendro spun on his heel and retreated to the barrel to fill a tankard. The gold coins steadily clinked into stacks, slid across the bar into place, and then began to stack again. It was a sound so hypnotic Gendro forgot to cap the keg when the beer was full, and he was only jostled from that hypnotic ticking by the spatter of spilling beer on the floor. Startled, Gendro jumped, sloshing more beer out from the overfull glass and following with a string of curses. The ticking stopped. "Is everything okay?" Yeah, just tired, I think," Gendro said, dumping the spilled beer with a wince, filling the tankard again and handing it to the traveler. Sorry for the wait, sir." But as Gendro turned to search for the cleaning brush, the traveler spoke again. "Treat yourself to another one. On me." Gendro gave a look back over his shoulder to confirm, and then spun around, turning his search for a cleaning brush into a search for another glass. The traveler was a weirdo, that was for sure, but there were very few men who Gendro couldn't enjoy a free beer with, especially when they were drinking the good stuff. Filling another glass to brimming for himself, Gendro left the keg just a hand's twist from open, and ignored the liquid that had splashed across the floor, at least for now. Guys like this could be milked for a whole lot of coin, more than it would take to replace a few moldy floorboards. Hey, to you and a strange story to share while the storm passes. The traveler took the glass, but said nothing in return. He carefully and deliberately lifted the beer to his lips, smelled it, swished it around, and then took a careful sip. When he'd finished, the stranger placed the beer down, took up the knife and fork Gendro had given him, and then began to dig into the roast and bread like it was the most important meal he had ever been served. For a while, it was like there was nothing else in the world but the dinner and the traveler, who only stopped to cock his head to one side now and then, as if deep in thought with each bite and each sip. Gendro tried twice to start a conversation, but with fork and knife in hand, it was like Gendro didn't even exist for the traveler. Well, except as a tool for more ale, and then for seconds and thirds of dinner, all interspersed with the occasional dismissive motion for Gendro to refill his own glass each time it ran empty. By the time the stranger had devoured the roast down to the bone, gristle, and broth, he asked for Gendro's finest liquors, which were mostly local moonshines and brandies distilled in the mountains nearby. When the traveler had sampled them all, he began working his way through Gendro's limited wine selection, dragging his drinking partner along with him the entire time. After explaining that he'd served all remaining edible food and some dubious extras, Gendro made his way back to the bar, finding himself a few shades shy of piss drunk and just about ready to call it a night. But the stranger had settled down into the rhythmic ticking of counting coin again, sipping his newest glass of wine intensely as the pile continued to grow. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edara and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.